Okay, well, let's get underway here and get started for Repair Priorities 2026. Excited to walk through this report. My name is Steve Davis. I'm the AVP of Transportation Strategy for Smart Growth America and the Director of Transportation for America, which is a program of Smart Growth America. And we're here to talk about what's in Repair Priorities 2026, which I believe is the fourth fourth edition of this report. Just really quickly, Transportation for America, we are a national nonprofit that's working to create a transportation system that safely and affordably connects everyone to jobs, services, and opportunities through a diverse range of travel options. We've got three really simple priorities. You can see those on the screen. You can find those on our website. We're going to talk about that big one in red today. Fix it first and prioritizing repair and maintenance. We're going to talk about that today at length. I'm really excited today to have two other people joining us here today from Transportation for America. I have Mukhtar, who is our primary author on the report this edition, and I'm also pleased to have Steve Ellis, who is the president of Taxpayers for Common Sense. Taxpayers for Common Sense and T4A have collaborated on this report. I think with every single edition that we've put out, we're really pleased to have them as a partner. We value their focus on the bottom line and on getting a good deal for taxpayers in the federal transportation program, which we're going to talk about at length today. So let me dive in. I want to start before we get into the findings of the report, which you can find on our website. I know a lot of you have probably already looked at it and read it, but I wanted to start with a story from Mississippi. Back in 1987, unlike maybe some other states, Mississippi did not have a lot of four-lane highways across their state. The interstates and a handful of larger highways were, bigger, a little wider, and then most of their highway network was two-lane highways through, what's a pretty rural state. And they had a long fight to try to raise the gas tax in 1987. And in 1987, they successfully raised their state gas tax to 18.4 cents a gallon, which is the same as the federal rate. They were super excited over the first, I think, 15 years of this gas tax. It brought in $2.6 billion, and they used this money to build more than 1,000 miles of four-lane highways all across the state. They had this goal of everybody being within 30 minutes or 30 miles of a four-lane highway, expanding commerce, giving everybody a little better, easier time to get across the state. But the big fatal flaw in this plan, that you can read about this great story from Dan Vach at Governing from 2018, was that they had absolutely no provisions in this gas tax increase to prioritize the repair of the system that they were going to dramatically expand. And so by 2018, a few years into this spending spree across the state of building, they hit a point where they were having to decide between keeping lightly used bridges open or being able to repave or in some cases rebuild roads that were used by more people. And they got stuck in this incredibly challenging position where they had an enormous maintenance backlog that was created by their own policy decisions. We had an event when we first launched our three priorities back in 2018 or 2019 on Capitol Hill. We had a former Mississippi Transportation Commissioner, Dick Hall. Their DOT is run by a three-person commission. He was one of them for a number of years, and he came and told part of this story and said, we've invested all that money to build a four-lane highway with absolutely no provision for maintaining what we've built, not a dime. And that has come back to haunt us. Is really incredible. And, once roads or bridges get into such bad condition, it costs significantly more money to maintain them. There's a tidbit in that story about how roads and just kind of like have just gotten into poor condition at the time, cost $50,000 to $70,000 per mile to fix. But this transportation engineer was talking about once they get a little beyond that, where we can't chip seal the pavement anymore, water's gotten into the pavement, it starts cracking underneath, we have to rebuild the road. It's $500,000 per mile. There is a real substantial cost to ignoring just normal ongoing preventive maintenance and repair. And the thing that stuck with me that Dick Hall said that day was, We had a handful of members of Congress in there and a lot of their staff in there. I think this was the launch of the Future Transportation Caucus meeting, and Dick Hall said, if you want us in the states, the state DOTs, to prioritize maintenance, then you're going to have to tell us you've got to do it. You've got to make some binding requirements to do that. Fast forward a few years. Last year, Mississippi finally raised their gas taxes for the first time since 1987, same time they phased out their income tax. Do they have any binding requirements with this new gas tax revenue to preserve their system? No. The money will go, it will be divided up between state-owned roads, county-owned roads. There's money set aside for a lot of these smaller roads and bridges. We'll see what their priorities look like, but let's circle back in 2035 and see where we're at. We as a country are on the same track that Mississippi has been on in this cycle of falling into disrepair, begging for more money, getting more money, spending some of it on repair, and expanding and building a bunch of stuff that costs a lot of money to maintain. There's a great quote from the guy that ran the Mississippi Road Builders Association at the time. I think it's in that story. He said, there is nothing conservative in ignoring the state's investment in infrastructure. If shingles were blowing off the roof of your house, you would put new shingles on. You would not wait until the deck was rotten before you replace them. Well, the shingles are off in Mississippi. When we have this cartoon that we made a few years ago is actually so out of date because there is so little dedicated, prioritized repair money within the federal transportation program at this point. And the number one ask for AASHTO and most of the trade organizations, especially the state DOTs, is give us flexibility, give us the money and let us spend it on the things that we think are the most important. And when they have this flexibility, sometimes it goes to repair, a portion of it goes to repair. That's what we're going to talk about today. But a lot of it goes to expanding the system. And that's how we end up in the same situation as Mississippi. I just want to note that federal and state policy on repair, what we actually have in the policy and how we prioritize the funds, what members of Congress think about prioritizing repair, it is deeply, deeply misaligned with what the public prioritizes and what the public believes about where their money goes. Public, when we've done some polling on this over the years, when you ask the public, when they find out that money is not guaranteed to go to repair, that states are free to build, states with terrible roads and bridges are free to build new roads and bridges, most people are pretty astonished. We've done some polling, this was a few years ago, 79% was the share of voters who believe that government should fix existing roads before building any new roads. This is not what the federal program does. It does nothing like this. Some other polling, message testing we did, which was about which of the following solutions are the best ones to reducing traffic. This is focused on congestion reduction. The number one choice, and this is again for congestion reduction, is repairing existing roads so that they work better for me. The bottom of the list, building new highways, adding lanes to highways and freeways. The public does not want their money going to this when they drive on and walk along and see the state of the infrastructure and the lack of repair. And when I talk about this misalignment between the public and legislators, there was a non-binding memo after the passage of the IIJA in 2021 from the Biden US DOT, basically just strongly encouraging states to prioritize repair with the windfall of cash that they got from the IIJA. They were encouraging them to do this because there was nothing binding in there requiring it. And you would have thought that new commandments had come down from on high. The way that a bunch of members of Congress responded to this. This was at a hearing with, I think, Pete Buttigieg, who was the secretary at the time, and there's Shelley Moore, Capito senator, holding a hearing with a big snapshot of this memo. These members of Congress lost their minds at the suggestion that they should prioritize repair. Nothing binding, nothing enforceable, nothing concrete. That perspective is so out of alignment with what their voters want them to do and want them to prioritize. So it's infrastructure week again. We believe that it will be the only infrastructure week this year. No calls for more weeks after it ends this week. And for the first time that I can remember, we have a 5-year reauthorization proposal that has landed right in the middle of infrastructure week. That doesn't usually happen. And most transportation trade groups are praising this 5-year bill to the heavens. This bill does not prioritize repair in any meaningful way. It does not do anything to get us off the track that Mississippi was on a couple decades ago. There will be a ton of new funding in this that will come from all taxpayers via the general fund because the gas tax brings in about half of what this bill is projected to spend. This report is all about the need to move beyond infrastructure week's pretty anodyne and generic calls for more investment in infrastructure and start talking about the right investment in infrastructure and outcomes. What are we going to get for the money? When we spend $500+ billion over the next 5 years, will we come out of it on the other end with roads and bridges in better condition, with more options for getting around, with streets, roads, sidewalks, everything that are safer for people? I heard at the Infrastructure Week event yesterday morning, Representative Larson trying to explain why several $100 billion to improve our roads and bridges from a C- to a C, as scored by the civil engineers, was a really important outcome that was worthwhile after spending, I don't know, $1 trillion in that time. And then the Highways and Transit Subcommittee Chairman, Representative Rouser from North Carolina, I think, was asked in a panel before that, what would be success from this bill? And he said, more roads and bridges. We have got to stop thinking in terms of more and start thinking in terms of better. And repair priorities, this report we're about to walk through, if it shows us anything, it's that we will not get there to those outcomes without some ironclad requirements to prioritize repair first. So with that, I want to pass it to Steve Ellis, who is the president of Taxpayers for Common Sense. Again, they joined us on this report. They joined us on our first edition of this report all the way back in 2011. Really excited to have Steve on here to bring a little bit of their lens to this issue. So thanks. Take it away, Steve. You're muted. All good.
There we go. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, Transportation for America, for including Taxpayers for Common Sense on this critical report. And as you mentioned, we've partnered with T4A on versions of this report since the very first one we released in 2011. I know because I was there. For more than 30 years, Taxpayers for Common Sense has been a national nonpartisan budget watchdog fighting to make government work for taxpayers. We focus on federal transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility because no matter where you are in the political spectrum, no one wants to see their tax dollars wasted. Steve set the table, and Mehr will get into the details, but I want to hit on some overarching themes and the impact on taxpayers. Sadly, repair priorities recommendations regarding how to improve the nation's roadways in the 2011, 2014, and 2019 reports still rings true. Even after hundreds of billions of tax dollars in spending, roads have barely improved. Why? The answer is the same. Too much is going to new lane miles and not enough to maintenance and repair. To be clear, some states have improved since we first started analyzing the data. But it is also true with increasing costs, the nation's taxpayers behind the wheel haven't seen much improvement as they would expect after tens of billions of dollars invested. Regardless, the experience of a fix-it-first approach in leading states should show the way to the rest of the country and federal policymakers. At Taxpayers for Common Sense, we have the fortune of being able to look at federal spending programs across the board. And whether you're talking about the Pentagon or energy projects or roads, the way to achieve better outcomes are underscored by the data and recommendations in this report. First, align priorities. We all know that investment in repair and maintenance limit future costs and are a better investment over wanton spending on new lane miles. It doesn't mean that there isn't a place for that, but fix it first says it all. Then, increase transparency. Trust is not a solution. Both at the state and federal level, taxpayers deserve to know how their tax dollars are being spent. are being spent. Information on spending must be easily available online in downloadable, sortable, and searchable formats. We must have measurable outcomes. Policymakers have to set measurable outcomes as far as the level of maintenance, repair, and quality for roads and bridges, and use the data to measure against them. Finally, attach strings. Federal policymakers need to place strings on federal funding if states are not delivering on transparency or outcomes. So much of the federal transportation spending is gas tax revenue. It is from the general treasury, as Steve pointed out. If all taxpayers are kicking in, whether they are driving or not, they have a right to demand their tax dollars are being spent appropriately and wisely. In summation, new roads are obligations. One of Taxpayers for Common Sense's fundamental solutions to eliminate waste is to avoid unnecessary long-term liabilities for taxpayers. Building an unnecessary new lane today that is going to be tomorrow's poor condition maintenance backlog is the very definition of that. The constant cry from lawmakers is that they need cash to fix roads, but instead of it going to repair, it is going to build more and new lane miles. It's less about how much and more just about how it is spent, especially since taxpayers are being forced to bail out the trust fund year after year for decades on end. They deserve an assurance that their tax dollars are being spent wisely, and that means a fix-it-first approach. I'm going to hand it off to Mehr to present the repair priorities present the repair priorities report findings. Mehr?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Steve. Well, thank you to both Steves. I'm going to start digging into some of the findings that we've seen in this report, and just starting off with maybe the most overarching theme or finding from this report is that despite $60 billion spent a year for both roads and bridges under the Historic Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, we've only seen roads in poor condition be reduced by about 3% from 2018 to 2024, which is the year that we were looking at the data for this report. So this is a historic investment, but despite this, we haven't seen meaningful improvements happen, and taxpayers are not seeing substantial returns on their dollars. And certainly there have been improvements, but these are incredibly modest and don't make a big dent in the overall backlog of roads and bridges in poor condition that we do have, and they come at an incredibly high cost. So what this report does, or what we set out to do, was understand how states were spending their money on federal aid eligible roadways, look at the overall state of repair, as well as examine some of the trends that we've been looking at for the last few years for this report. And to do so, the data that we looked at, next slide, please, was using published data by FHWA as well as the US DOT, and looking at statistics such as the Federal Highway Statistics Series as well as the National Bridge Inventory. And again, the time period for this report was 2018 to 2024. And for the roads that we look at, we're concerned specifically with federal aid eligible roadways, which are typically some of the larger roadways that we see, like interstates, arterials, and collector roads. We also have an incredibly robust and long 35-page appendix if anyone is curious about looking through the methodology and spending a lot of time in spreadsheets, which is definitely what I did while writing this report. Moving on to some of the findings that we've seen. So since the first edition, we have certainly seen changes in how states are spending their money on repair. Between 2004 and 2008, we were seeing states spending more money on expansion versus repair. During the next iteration of the report, we saw that the spending had sort of evened out and expansion and repair spending was mostly equal. And now we have seen an overall positive trend in how states are doing their repair spending. About on average, 25% of state DOTs are spending on expansion, and then there's 39% on repair, which is definitely a good shift that we're seeing. Another interesting finding that we had was that states are also spending a substantial share of their funding in this one category as other expenditures. And this is an FHWA defined category, which can truly include anything from traffic operations to control systems, environmental enhancements, and safety engineering. And certainly this category could signal some positive spending in things like improved safety outcomes. But I just wanted to flag that this is an issue we were seeing in terms of data transparency and reporting, where it's hard to really measure where money is going. And when you can't really have an insight into what money is being spent on, you can't really track the outcome. So that's something that was popping up during our research as well. And in the next observation, which I'm sure is clear to everyone, just in a matter of a couple of slides, is we've had some spending going towards a positive direction, but in spite of this, we're really failing to move the needle in a meaningful sense on road and bridge conditions. And that's on a national level. And there are different varying trends, obviously, state by state. Some states are doing better than others, but just in general, 17% of states saw an increase in their percentage of roads in poor condition from during this time period. We have states like Maryland and Texas, which saw some of the largest increases. And Texas is one of those states that since we started doing this report, we've been seeing sort of a worrying continuing trend of roads in poor conditions increasing. So again, some of these states are on these long trajectories of not doing well on their repair outcomes. And we also have a lot of data in general for both roads and bridges that you can dig through if you're curious to see how your state is doing on terms of their spending and what both their road and bridge outcomes are, whether for improvements or for worsening conditions. We also have a section on bridge conditions, which shows that there's been an increase in the percentage of bridges in poor condition as well for 12 states. Again, there are some states like Utah, Vermont, Washington, which have seen the highest increases. And I do want to point out that there was a modest decline in the general national percentage of bridges in poor condition, but state by state, again, some of the results that we're seeing are varying. And we really encourage you to dig into your state statistics as well, because there's a lot of interesting information on how individual states are doing. And we've categorized them as well because we were interested in those questions. Just in terms of thinking about how funding is matching up with percentage in road conditions, but we've seen about 1.5 trillion we spent over the last 30 years, but we really haven't seen that progress be made across that time. And what this is definitely telling us is that there's no shortfall of funding and we have enough money to make the change that we want. But that's exactly the issue that we're coming to the heart of. It's not about how states are spending their money or how much money they have to spend, but it's about where that money is going and what they're spending it on. The federal transportation program does give states a good degree of flexibility in terms of thinking about what they're spending their money on and how that's being allocated. But historically, we've seen states spend that money on building out new infrastructure with mostly zero plans on how to maintain that infrastructure in the future. And this has led to them neglecting their maintenance needs and a massive growing backlog of roads and bridges in poor condition. Next slide, please. One of the reasons that we see road conditions not improving, although there is good spending happening, is that simultaneously, while states are spending more on repair, they've also spent a lot of time on expanding their system. And what this does is it makes it substantially harder to catch up on the maintenance backlog, because every time you do a capacity expansion, you're adding a new lane mile, which has long-term operational costs, long-term maintenance costs over their entire life cycle. Often we see policymakers talk about economic growth that's needed in regions and roads and new infrastructure as vehicles to be able to do that or as assets. But frankly, roads can be financial liabilities if states are not managing and planning for them properly and allocating money to make sure that they can be taken care of during their lifetime, in addition to existing infrastructure that exists. We've also seen a huge increase in the public road network. There's been an addition of over 100,000 new lane miles being added, and that's the equivalent, like this graph shows, of a new single lane mile spanning the country 45 times. That sounds like a really, really bad and uncomfortable road trip, and that's the sort of priority we have for building out in this country. And it would cost 5.3 billion a year just to maintain this new road network. This is not even accounting for the money that it would cost to bring other infrastructure that's already built into a state of good condition or even fair condition. And this is one of the most fiscally irresponsible things we can do for our taxpayer money. every time we don't invest a dollar in every time, sorry, we do invest a dollar in an expansion project or building out a new lane mile, we take away a dollar that could be spent on repair and on maintenance. And this is also a dollar that is creating decades of future repair costs, which will cost much, much more because of increasing inflation, increasing construction costs, and it's truly a liability for taxpayer money in the future. By doing this, the backlog also grows so large that it's really hard for states to catch up, even when they are making right decisions like spending more money on repair, which we saw earlier. And I'm going to illustrate this through a case study as well. We were really curious about thinking how states are spending their money and what those outcomes look like. So we decided to go ahead and categorize some of these states, looking at a ratio of how they're spending on maintenance and then how they're spending on expansion, and then what the outcomes were for their roads based on that. And we had some unpredictable and predictable results. But looking at a predictable one, I'm going to tell a quick story about West Virginia and what their spending and road conditions look like. So West Virginia, under Governor Jim Justice, they launched a super ambitious Roads to Prosperity program, which had $2.8 billion allocated to it through tax revenue, as well as 30-year general obligation bonds, which they were using to promise economic growth through new infrastructure projects. And what ended up happening is that they very quickly committed all of these bonds and they left, I think it was in 7 years, and then left very little money for any maintenance for either existing infrastructure or even planning for maintaining the new infrastructure that they were building. And as you can imagine, this very quickly started to have terrible consequences for what the state was doing. There was a press conference that was held by now the new governor, Patrick Morrisey, who is working very hard to shift how the DOT is envisioning spending their money and what they're spending their money on. But essentially, West Virginia was saddled with a significant amount of long-term debt and annual interest payments. And they sort of threw their hands up and said, we run out of money on how the transportation program over here is spending. And again, their road conditions are the 9th worst in the country. 19% of their bridges are in poor condition and 26% of their roads are in poor condition. And in the way that they decided to strategize their spending, they didn't align what their system needed with what they were going to allocate their funding towards. And this led to the conclusion that their deferred maintenance didn't simply just go away. It's still there, continue to compound, and it's going to cost them much more down the line, as well as other states who have made incredibly similar choices in how they're allocating their transportation spending. And we are seeing them shift the strategy, pivot a little bit towards maintenance. But again, having billions of dollars to spend on infrastructure doesn't really mean anything if we're not very conscientiously looking at plans to maintain this infrastructure as well. I'm going to pass it back to Steve to walk us through some policy recommendations for how we can make sure that we're tying priorities to funding and then outcomes.
Great. Thank you, Mehr. If you guys have questions about what you've seen and the findings, drop them into the Q&A. We're going to have some time for questions at the end. Encourage all of you to look through the report and just poke through it. It's a pretty easy read. This West Virginia story hints at a section we have that kind of puts states into one of 4 quadrants with good spending, bad spending, good outcomes, bad outcomes. Very interesting to look at that and kind of dive into the numbers on your state. So we're in the midst of this reauthorization cycle. We have a draft bill out right now that kind of fails to move the needle on repair. So if we could wave a magic wand, and actually, I don't think it even has to be that magic. We've come pretty close to this before. I'm going to get there at the end. But how could our reauthorization proposal, how could the policy in there produce different outcomes? We have what we think are some pretty simple recommendations in repair priorities that also tie into our overarching goal on repair that we've been working on for years. And let me just walk through them. We have kind of 3 broad areas. The first one is that we need to start guaranteeing measurable outcomes for taxpayers. And we will do that by establishing clear, measurable goals for improving road and bridge conditions. Where do we want to be at the end of an authorization? How far to the right side of the ledger do we want the needle to move? And if we do this, this is the way that we're going to We have to stop doing the massive deficit spending when we have no plan for how to measure the outcomes that we're going to get for it. And again, the outcomes that are supported by voters. Voters want to see their money going towards repair. They want to see things getting better. That's not happening. So starting in 2012, we have this created this pretty milquetoast performance measurement system in MAP 21, where states and metro areas are required to set targets. They can set targets to get worse across these, whatever it is, 7, 9 performance measure categories. They can set targets on almost any of these to get worse. They can miss their targets. They can set wildly ambitious targets that they never reach. This has become a paperwork exercise. The idea is to, and the trade in 2012 was give states more flexibility, but let's create a system of measuring performance and say, okay, fine, you want to control all the money with nobody telling you what you can spend it on and what you can't spend it on. That's fine. Spend it how you like. You just have to make progress on these things, except we never required the progress. We need to set targets to improve road and bridge conditions, and we need to have penalties for failure. If you miss your targets and you have to set targets to improve, then you lose the ability to spend money from your biggest formula programs on new capacity. You have to start prioritizing repair. It's very simple stuff. It makes sense to taxpayers. It makes less sense to a lot of policymakers. Okay, second, we just have to require the repair of our existing systems before expansion. You can absolutely spend your federal money on new capacity. 100%. There's a lot of places in this country where we need a road that doesn't exist. We need connectivity within a grid. We need a new road. To do that, the state needs to demonstrate that they have the capacity to operate and maintain it over its useful life, along with the rest of your system. The same way when the mortgage system is operating correctly, you have to prove your income to be able to sign up for that mortgage payment over a period of time. When we got into a mess was when we stopped doing that, right? So secondly, have some financial incentives that will prioritize repair. One way you could do that, lower the match rates for new capacity projects. You can absolutely still spend this money on new capacity. You just have to put more of your local or state money in the game to do it. It has to really be important for you. Priorities get a little can get a little confusing when the federal government is picking up, 80 or 90% of the project. When you have to put more of your money into it, then it's going to be something that's very, very important to you. But keep the match rates high for doing repair. That's the thing that makes sense to spend the bulk of the federal money on is repair. Okay, so require repair of existing systems. The last one is really just about data and transparency. Having worked on this report a few times now, let me just tell you how bad this data is. And how limited it is. We're also, again, talking about only the federal aid network. We don't have great data on the rest of the public road network. The federal aid highway network is just a relatively small portion of the roads that exist all across the country and they get used. The data lags by several years. The quality of the data is not great. FHWA needs to start, and they will only start doing this if Congress requires it, collecting and publishing standardized, comprehensive data on road conditions, lane miles, federal spending, and more granular data on the federal spending. We should not have 30% of spending classified as other, with no details. We need to know the location of the projects. We need to be able to quickly identify when projects increased capacity, when they were a straight repair project, and also start to wrap our heads around the long-term maintenance costs. Second, God bless anybody that's ever tried to go and find and or understand the Transportation Improvement Program documents or the State Transportation Improvement Program documents that basically lay out the projects that a state or a metro area is going to fund with their federal dollars over the next 5 years. They're required to produce these documents. They all come in different formats. They're all on different websites. They are not centrally located. They don't get stored with FHWA. That needs to change. They need to use a uniform format so that taxpayers can more easily look at where their money is going and also have project descriptions that actually describe the project and help them understand what kind of project their money is going towards. And then they need to explain in these documents how the projects that they have selected in the collective are going to make progress towards their repair targets. They have the targets and they pick 5 years of projects and say, we're picking these because we think this is going to move the needle this far, and explain how and document it. The data has to get better. The reporting has to get better to provide more transparency, but also accountability for all of this money that we are pouring into this program. I have heard people say that these three improvements sound far-fetched. These sound really hard to do. We saw the way that Congress reacted to a non-binding memo encouraging states to prioritize repair. I don't think that it is as far-fetched as some people say it is. And again, voters will back legislators up that do this. They will 100% back them up. In negotiations for the IIJA, which started just like this cycle with a House passed bill called the Invest in America Act, I think just the Invest Act for short. This bill was terrific on repair. And interestingly, it had a lot of loopholes when it was first released. And there was a bipartisan amendment from, I think, Representatives Chuy Garcia and Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin to make some fixes to the repair provisions. And the final version that passed was terrific. This is what was in it. 20% of NHPP and the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program are dedicated to repair out the gate. Full stop. You have to spend that fifth of the program on repair. For states that want to build new roadway capacity, totally permitted. It's fine. But to do that, you have to demonstrate that you're making progress on repair. You have to present a financial plan for maintaining the new facility. You have to do a BCA, which they're in the habit of doing all the time, but you have to use demand models that actually have a demonstrated track record of accuracy. The models that they use most often are terrible with a track record of accuracy. Go back and look at the, predicted, vehicle counts on a project that got built 10 years ago before it was built. The ones used to justify the enormous widening or expansion. They are so far off from reality. They also go upwards. They'll predict everybody will experience 2 hours of delay if we don't build this. People don't operate that way. They opt out at some point. They find another way. These models don't recognize that. They need to use better models. And then prove that they have considered what else they could do to show that this new capacity is the most cost-effective choice. And then rather than considering only the impacts on maybe one single performance measure, like congestion reduction, which gets used to justify a whole lot of expansion that costs a whole lot of money, they have to measure and consider the benefits of all the other performance measures. And there were some new ones that were created in the Invest Act in addition to the ones from 2012. But they have to consider the benefits that would come for safety, from reducing emissions, from improving access for all people to all destinations within the area, and start to quantify those things. So this is doable. We have a really good model from the Invest Act, which the leadership in the House T&I committee, as they mark up their bill tomorrow, this is 100% the model that they should be looking at to fold into this bill. As Steve said, if we're going to ask taxpayers to kick in $150 billion or whatever the amount is going to be to cover the cost of this bill above what the gas tax brings in, I think this is the bare minimum that we should be requiring to ensure that we come out the other side of this with roads, bridges, transit systems, everything that are in a better state of repair than before we poured $500 billion into the system, which so far is not producing on our outcomes. So that's that. We will leave it there and open it up for any questions. I know we have a few questions in the Q&A, and let me see. We'll walk through some of these. I'm just going to start at the top. Jeffrey Hoban, Steve mentioned the order of magnitude increase when basic roadway repair is neglected and roads have to be rebuilt. Has T4A or anyone else compared life cycle cost per mile of highway to rail or dedicated transit right-of-way? It's not something that we have looked at. I thought the question was going to be about that actual magnitude increase, and I have seen a study on that a few years ago. I think we actually had it in repair priorities and a few years ago, where essentially if a road costs $1 to maintain every year, if you don't do it for 4 years, it doesn't cost $4 in year 4. It actually costs 16. There's some studies on that, I think. But I don't think I haven't seen anything that compares the life cycle costs on highway to transit. It may be a little apples and oranges. Um, let's see. Okay, financial instruments. What financial instruments can be encouraged in things like the authorizing legislation or state appropriations bills that shift spending towards repair? I, I don't have a great answer for this other than to say I think a lot of the financial instruments, if we could steer the formula programs towards prioritizing repair, then a lot of the financial instruments actually make more sense for the new capacity. Because you can make the case. You have to do a BCA. You have to, some of them may be toll roads that have a repayment mechanism that makes them a good candidate for a financing program rather than a funding program. So I think actually if you can fix the underlying program and start to prioritize repair with formula dollars, then actually having the financial instruments be focused more on expansion might actually be the other way to go. But I don't know. Others might have some different opinions on that one.
No, certainly that makes sense to me. I mean, and at the very least, let's get the formula right, and then we can deal with the other issue if we need to. But certainly dedicating the formula funds to maintenance makes sense. And then if there's financing options for new capacity, well, then as long as we know that the states can maintain that going forward, or the private entity can maintain that going forward.
Yeah, great point. I'm jumping to the chat. Our good friend Peter Vanderzee, who knows more about bridge inspections than anyone I've ever met, makes the very good point about how we assess bridge condition. It's very subjective. It's very highly variable. The bridge inspection in this country basically involves engineers who are all trained very, very differently, ostensibly have the same standards they're looking for, but trained in different places, different schools, different training, and they go down and look under the bridge. And that's that's the gist of how we inspect bridges. And it's 2026, and it's time to start to bring a little bit more technology to that. And if you want to know more, reach out to Peter Vanderzee, who can probably put his information in the chat. He's got some great points about inspecting bridges. And it's a great idea. I think we actually have some of this in our platform, but that I didn't mention is actually changing the visual inspection methodology for bridges. It's a great point. It's certainly overdue to change. Let's see. Canyon. Wildwood asks, should we work towards a version of the Invest Act for the next STA, for the next surface reauthorization, or could we move something similar sooner and under Build America 250 Act? It's a great question. We would love to see the House start with something that looks like the Invest Act. I don't know if I mean, I think most of us are pretty dubious about this thing passing and getting fully done this year, especially with a lot of the disagreements that they have with the Senate, even on just the basic funding issues. So this will almost certainly be going to the next Congress. Will they use the Build America Act as the starting point, or will they look a little further back? I think, hopefully there will be some talk in the markup tomorrow about some of these repair provisions, which have been offered before in the past. And hopefully we could see at least a conversation started about that.
Steve, I think that it's critical. You lay the groundwork because you're never quite sure when the iron is hot and you can strike. And so you want to be talking about this, pushing these ideas forward. And so I think it's always possible. And I agree with you that this is, very little is going to get done this Congress. And so this is something that if you lay the groundwork this Congress, then we're in a better place to pick it up again in the next Congress.
Yeah, great point.
I'm seeing a question from Paul about if there's been a study about where the roads in needs of repair are and where they're located. We didn't geographically isolate for all of the roadways that we looked at, but we did do a comparison of urban versus rural roadways. And what we saw was that states are generally spending a little bit more money on repair for roads in urban areas, but urban areas are, or urban roadways, they are in significantly poorer condition relative to some of the rural roads. I believe it's about 27% of urban roads are in poor condition versus 11% of rural roadways are in poor condition. And it's interesting because we like sort of get this down to a couple different factors, which could be its higher population exposure. There's more impact on those roads, but the repair costs do suggest that maybe there should be a bigger share of repair investment going into some of the urban roads. And another thing relatedly to some of the questions about congestion that I'm seeing in the chat as well are that with congested urban areas, sometimes we see state DOTs getting into a cycle of wanting to fix congestion by expanding their roadways. But this is also a very costly strategy, which doesn't really improve congestion, but then creates more traffic through induced demand and ends up just increasing repair and maintenance backlogs because the money that could be going to maintenance instead ends up going to expansion for those areas.
There's a question from Daniel about tracking inflation and cost increases for price of repairs. I don't know that anyone has looked specifically into the price of repair versus other types, but I mean, there's some good research from that I saw from Jeff Davis at Eno about just how much inflation ate into the increases in the IIJA for all of the talk of its historic investment levels. Across the board, there's some good research that the inflation costs, especially over the life of this bill, when things really skyrocketed in the last couple of years, that really ate up a lot of the purchasing power of the IIJA, which to us really makes an even stronger case for prioritizing repair. If the amount of money that you have is not really the amount of money that you thought you were going to have, then it becomes really important to prioritize repair. The thing that we didn't talk about with the roads or assets or liabilities is you could kind of hear it in that West Virginia story. There's a really long tail on this stuff and these decisions that get made. You build a new road now, your maintenance costs aren't skyrocketing during this first life cycle. During the first 5 years or 10 years, you've got a nice new gold-plated road, and especially if you're in Florida or Arizona or Nevada or somewhere where it's sunny all year long, you're in good shape. But then you got to pay the piper down the road, and that all hits. So there's this very long tail effect with these decisions that get made. So,
and it's when the next governor's in office, just like you're saying in West Virginia.
Yeah. Well, and that ties into another question I saw about. Hold on, where was it? This is a great question, Keith Sorensen. Can you talk about why politicians are more interested in building new roads and highways instead of repairing and maintaining existing ones, despite what their constituents want? You want to jump in, Steve?
Well, there's one where you have a ribbon cutting and you saw everybody kind of gathering around there. And when you are fixing a road, one is the people who are using that road, there's an inconvenience, there's a factor that's going on there. They want the improved road, but it's not necessarily as popular. So it's just not as politically sexy or attractive, even though it's a much better way of going about things is to fix it first.
Mm-hmm. There is a question about for concerned residents, who should folks reach out to, mayor, city council? Yes, all of the above, and your member of Congress, especially, as well. Tell them what's important to you. Definitely, like I said, a lot of this report focuses on the federal aid highway network. So, for the most part, and there's 2-lane roads in there, sure, but it's a lot of, 4-lane and bigger roads, the arterials, the busy roads where you live, or that connect you to, bigger places, that sort of thing. So step one, I think, is getting a sense of like who's responsible for this road, which can be pretty easy to figure out who owns this and who's responsible. But you should absolutely reach out to your members of Congress, especially right now as they're debating this bill. You should call them and tell them that you want to see a bunch of this $580 billion go into repair. There was one other question. Hang on. Yeah, about incentivizing what can be done at the state or local level to incentivize repair first. Are there any state or local NPOs that are good examples? There are definitely a lot of states that are good examples. You can find them in this report. Meher might be able to talk about a few.
Yeah.
But there are states that are spending their money right. The one thing I was going to add, and then let Meher jump in, is
Mhm.
that you know, cities, especially, they have a lot of incentive already, cities and counties, to prioritize maintenance because you know what they can't do? They can't deficit spend. They can't print money. If they have stuff they have to take care of and they have competing needs, they have to choose. In Mississippi, a lot of those bridges were off system, not federal aid bridges that counties were responsible for. And they're, trying to decide, do we keep the bridge open that's, I mean, very rural and isolated, gets 10 cars a day, or the road nearby that gets 250 cars a day? They have to make those decisions, which gives them a lot more incentive to think about repair on the front end. And a lot of cities are rarely, um, they don't have the space or the expense to do massive expansion. So repair is really their bread and butter.
Absolutely. And also, there's a lot of great questions about how we can link these findings to advocacy on a local and state level, which are some of my personal favorite questions. But this report does focus on state DOTs and their role in investment, just based on where they sit in transportation decision making. MPOs are obviously also an important part of the framework of transportation agencies and decision makers, but are more often focused on project prioritizations and those sorts of things versus who's making the investment decisions, which are the DOTs, but advocacy functions at all levels, top down, bottom up, etc. So always great to reach out to any folks in those circles to try to compel shifting some of that spending. But in terms of states that are doing well for spending, we've seen the Dakotas, both North and South, Minnesota, as well as Vermont, as some examples of states that are improving their investment strategies to align with what they want to see within their system in terms of better outcomes. To my knowledge, I'm not sure if all of those states have any Fix It First amendments specifically introduced through their state legislature. I know Minnesota has been working on one, but the basic thing that they've done on a state DOT level is just prioritize repair, and this has just led them to focus on more maintenance projects, resulting in higher share of roads in good condition and just avoiding maintenance backlogs that are too great for them to be able to make a dent in it. So it's just shifting earlier towards repair and then maintaining a steady level of investment into that repair, which has shown how much focusing that spending can preserve a system better. So just even a basic investment decision annually made by a DOT can start to make a big dent in conditions for roads and bridges.
Mhm. There's a little more of a comment I saw come in early about maintenance budgets can include funds to dismantle freeways, highways, such as those being considered in California and Oakland, I-81 and Syracuse, which were all disastrous for urban inner city neighborhoods. Remove the freeway, reduce the maintenance liability. Absolutely, sometimes you can spend money to make money, to save money. I think what's really important about this is that it recognizes the nature of roads as a liability. That you have that roadway that is as long as you want that thing to stand, you have to have money to pay for it, its maintenance and its upkeep. Unfortunately, in this House proposal, the Reconnecting Communities program, also known as the Neighborhood Access and Equity Program, is essentially gone. The what becomes the new Build, Raise, Tiger grant program keeps reconnecting communities as an eligibility for competitive grants, but I certainly wouldn't, considering that this administration canceled all of the existing NAE grants, I wouldn't expect that would be a likely project type that they would fund. That's certainly something we would love to see come back because we spent a lot of federal money to create this damage, and spending some money to both ameliorate the damage and the effects while also lowering the overall long-term costs, I think is a smart thing to do.
For sure. I'm seeing a question about what kinds of regulations could be put in place to make sure that BCAs are held to higher standards for calculating the value of road maintenance over a given lifespan. And these are some conversations that we're going on in the release of the Surface Transportation Bill these days. Very similar to the provisions that were in the Invest Act about Fix It First. There was an amendment that was asking for benefits cost analyses to be done that shows that if you're choosing to do a capacity expansion, that it considers total maintenance costs of an asset over the life cycle of that. It demonstrates that it's more cost effective to do the capacity expansion than do a maintenance project. So these are some regulations of sorts going into or hoping to go into these bigger policy conversations at a federal level, which can then compel decision making to take BCAs into consideration for maintenance versus expansion projects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we've got just a couple of minutes left. I think we're gonna wrap up so we don't go over any final words from you two before we close it down.
No, just thank you again to Smart Growth America and T4A for having us on, and really happy to work with you on this report. And it's a very critical issue, and fix it first.
Fix it first, all the way. Print the T-shirt.
And if anyone has any questions on the report or want to talk through their state findings and thinking about how to link that to advocacy, always happy to chat. We know what we're not doing well. We know what Congress should be doing to allow for different outcomes. So let's consider how we can act and change this moving forward.
And actually, I do have one PSA, and that is the head of SGA, Beth Osborne, is going to be on the Budget Watchdog AF All Federal podcast that we have on Friday. And so you can subscribe at taxpayer.net or wherever you get your podcasts and listen to Beth wax poetically about this report and other transportation issues.
That's great. Great plug. Okay, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Taxpayers for Common Sense. Thank you, Mehr, for walking through the findings. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Be in touch if you have further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.